Hey everyone, welcome. I'm Dave Rubenstein, Editor-in-Chief of SD Times. I'd like to welcome you to today's program on SD Times Live. The presentation is called "The Expanding Developer Domain Brings Increased Responsibilities." Joining me for the conversation today are Steve Poole. He's a developer advocate at security solutions provider Sonotype, and Brian Fox, CTO at Sonotype. Thanks for being here, guys.
Thanks for having us.
All right. Well, before we get started, I just have a couple of quick housekeeping announcements. There'll be a live Q&A going on during the presentation. So anytime you have a question, just go to your control panel, go to the questions tab, type it in, hit submit, of course, and we'll answer as many as time allows us to get to. Secondly, this session is going to be recorded for playback to your heart's content and will be available on the sdtimes.com website starting tomorrow. So as we've been reporting in SD Times, the way software development is done today has changed dramatically from the methods and processes employed in the past. As the pace of development has quickened, it's become necessary to move testing, security, and even governance into the developer's list of responsibilities. Today, we're going to focus on security. And let me start with you, Steve. So we hear the term DevSecops touted today as a way to shift security left in the development lifecycle. So what have been the challenges that organizations face in adopting this kind of approach, and what are the benefits that they get from it?
Okay, well, so it's a good question. So the challenges are very much the same sort of challenges that we've seen in the past with things like adopting DevOps and things. If you think of Agile, that was the very first point where we tried to bring the testers into and the customers right up to the front, moving left to the part of the process. And DevOps did the same, bringing the ops guys in. And now with DevSecops, it's very similar, trying to get security guys to be involved in the decision process right at the beginning, and also getting developers involved in understanding what the security guys need. So the challenges, if anything, is we've got people talking, but they still talk different languages. They still have different challenges. So a lot of the issues are the mismatch between these people's expectations. I think that's the biggest challenge we have.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So one of the questions that I've always wondered about in this topic is, how are developers expected to keep up with security and the vulnerabilities? They haven't been trained for it. They don't know where to look for a lot of these things. And especially with the modern complexity of today's applications, where they're not even writing a lot of the code, they're just bringing in other functionality through APIs and other things. So how are they expected to actually become security experts, and how are they dealing with this? Brian, maybe you can take that.
Yeah, it's a very real problem. I think that as usage of open source has expanded, and the awareness of that usage within organizations has increased, as evidenced by 10 years ago, we would talk to executives downloading tens of thousands of components from Maven Central, the repository that we run, and they would say, we're not using any open source. The executives had no idea that was the case. That's mostly not true anymore. And so what's happened is, the usage went first, the awareness came second, tooling is kind of catching up. There are tools, there are capabilities out there that can help developers understand more information about the dependencies that they're using. But most organizations are just very early in their usage of those tools. They probably don't even actually have a handle of the bill of materials across their organization. So when a new vulnerability comes out, they have no idea if they're even using the component, if they should even care or not. And if you're in that kind of scenario, you're several steps removed from being able to actively take controls and provide information to developers. But we're starting to see over the last couple of years, a shift in development towards recognizing that this is a problem, that understanding the security, legal, and quality posture of components is kind of table stakes for doing good dependency management. And people starting to adopt tooling to actually help them with that. But I think the challenge has largely been that, you know, the knee-jerk reaction to organizations that suddenly were aware that 80% of their portfolio came from code they didn't write, was to overcorrect and try to lock down and be very rigid about how they manage those components, but without providing developers the options to actually make better choices up front. It was a very reactionary, as everything human. It's like that. We always overreact in the beginning, and then, you know, the pendulum swings and we course correct. So I think we're kind of in the middle of that right now. Where the pendulum is on a given organization really depends.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen, as I say, the overreaction. We've seen situations where you've got developers who know that they need to update dependency to get rid of a vulnerability, but they have to go through this process, not only of going with the engineering team to make it happen, but also, you know, with the security team, but also to get permission to use the next version, because you see so many companies who go, we're going to be absolutely prescriptive. It's going to be this version and this version and this version and this version, you know, and you can't manage that. That breaks in its own sort of way.
Yeah, it doesn't scale. I mean, I saw those types of processes, you know, a decade and a half ago, which kind of led to, you know, how Sonotype approaches the problem is that, you know, we recognize that, you know, one of two things happen whenever you talk to somebody and they say, oh, we have a process for that and developers can't use anything that's not approved. Well, either you're kidding yourself, you probably have that policy, but it's not enforceable and not enforced. Therefore, you're pretending that it's actually doing something. If you actually are really locked down, then you've probably broken the back of your developers and they've given up. And this is why, you know, whenever I speak at conferences in the beginning, when I'm just killing time, I'll always ask, you know, who here is using Struts 1? You know, this Struts 1 has been like level 10 vulnerable for what, like 18 years now? It's like, it's crazy how long. There's always somebody in the audience who raises their hand and I ask them why. And the answer is always some form of, because that's what's on the approved list. And it's too much work to get anything else in place. And so, you know, when organizations over-rotate and create these draconian processes, they actually trade one problem for another. They're trading perceived risk for technical debt, for sure. If you make it so hard for the developers to actually stay current and make good decisions, you're just making the problem worse. So when something does become seriously vulnerable, now you're on basically an abandoned version of some project, and now you might have to rewrite your application because you haven't kept up to date for 18 years. That's probably not what you meant, but it is the unintended consequences of being too strict and binding the developer's hands.
Well, that's an interesting take. I mean, we've been talking a lot about security in the last year and a half, obviously, in the light of all the attacks and hacks and ransomware and things happening. And it's really the first time I've heard somebody phrase it in that way, that developers are expected to do this, but yet have their hands tied with how they can best approach the problem. So, so obviously the perception of risk is a decision that's being made higher up from the developer, and they're the ones who are kind of locking things down, and leads to the question, if developers are responsible for security, are they the people who are also assessing, well, yes, there's a vulnerability here, but it's not one that leads to anything important, so we can kind of leave it for now, even though that does create technical debt? I think there was a question in there somewhere, Steve, maybe you can.
Yeah, so are they responsible? Yeah, we've made lots of businesses have made them responsible. They've not been enabled, either from an education point of view, from a tooling point of view, to deal with it. Most of them understand about dependencies, but the ability to assess the risk, developers just aren't educated to do that. So the best you can hope is that they see something that says you should move to the next version, and they'll plan it in, because it's not just about educating them about the approach and how to think about it, but it's the other flip side of this as well. It's understanding the threat landscape and how at risk you are and stuff like that. It's very hard.
Right.
You know, it's very much like we've gone from a place where we would trust anybody we could leave our doors and windows unlocked. And that was the case a long time ago. It's not like that anymore. But most developers have not been exposed to all the bad things going on. So a lot of them just feel that they're in that same world. and it's becoming a shock now to realize just how many bad guys are out there and how they can get in.
Right. So we have a poll question that I'm going to push out now to our attendees. And the question is, do you feel you have the right tools to make security-oriented decisions while you're doing development? So let's put that out there and let people tell us where they're at on that. And so while we're waiting on that decision, kind of something that you said, Steve, is leading me to think about the notion of zero trust. Some people say that this is, perhaps one of the best ways to lock things down. Other people say if you do that, you'll never be able to do business because it will just bring everything to a crawl. I was just curious to see if you had any thoughts on that.
Zero trust. So I think that's probably a bad idea. But a lot of this is just it's assessing the risk. So you can put trust in the system when in the right places. I'm not sure that locking it down and saying you can trust nobody is going to get you very far. You have to make some trust. At the end of the day, we're all relying on other people in the software chain. Whether it's the operating system guys or the people producing the hardware, there is some level of trust. We're making those assertions. We've just got to be comfortable that there's some proof in the process and that we understand that this particular supplier of software can be trusted and is doing the right stuff to allow us to use their software. If you don't do that, then we're going to move away from complete open source software. You're going to write everything yourself. The bill would be a bit big.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so we closed the poll. The question, of course, do you feel that you have the tools that you need to make security-oriented decisions? 14% said yes, 43% said no, and 43% said they're working on it. So is that kind of what you would expect to see in today's landscape?
I have to say, my exposure talking to developers is that the 14% is quite high. I don't know what Brian thinks.
Yeah. I think that second 43% is people that didn't vote, I think, is what that means. So it's 14% yes, 43% no, and the rest didn't answer, is my interpretation of this. But that largely tracks with what I would have expected. I think, companies haven't empowered developers to do the right thing because they're still in reactionary mode. They're reacting to, first, lack of visibility into open source component vulnerabilities. So you see legacy behaviors that are very much scan and scold. Security team comes in, has a tool, finds stuff, throws it back at development. We've seen the first reaction was, well, let's get more visibility in those tools to provide this, visibility into the open source components, and still throw it back at development, where it is often summarily ignored or rejected or debated, and very little change actually happens. But when you empower the developers to see the information, and when you make the right answer for the business the easiest answer for the developers, then the right things start to happen, right? And Steve touched on it a bit, I think, on the previous question. We've seen so many instances where take NVD, the vulnerabilities disclosures. Historically, those were written with security professionals and operations teams in mind, not the developers. And so, my favorite example is, a vulnerability in Bouncy Castle. It says Bouncy Castle is subject to a Blinkenbacher attack. You should update. I didn't know what that was. I'm not ashamed to say it. I Googled it, and then I read it, and it basically tells me a Blinkenbacher attack allows somebody to collect your data, and when you collect enough data, you can reverse engineer the private key and then read all the data you collected going back in time. Okay, now if I just told you, the developer, that was going to happen on the thing that you were trying to secure, you can't deny that. You go, wow, I should fix that, right? So, but if you don't provide that context, it's easy for a developer to look at it and go, well, it probably doesn't apply, but I don't have time to dig into it. It's probably not going to affect us. It's probably not, used in my code. And so, the approach we try to take is to provide that information in an accessible description so that, you can't ignore it, that it is completely internalized by development. And the same goes for approaches. I still see it a lot. Companies say, I just want to give a list. I just want to send a list to all of development, to the whole company, and say, everybody just stop using this thing. Everybody update to this version. And that sounds like an easy thing to do, but that usually has unintended consequences too. Not everybody is using the components in the same way. Not everybody's going to have the same exploit paths. Not everybody's going to have the same test coverage, right? So you create a ton of unnecessary work that maybe gets very little payback. And the gear mashing between development and security that's built up is largely scar tissue from those exact behaviors. A company that suddenly starts doing static code scanning that sends a report and says, fix all the things.
Yes.
And then they create more bugs in the act of fixing the things that probably weren't actually exploitable anyway, right? This new reaction is just a new form of that. So, in terms of tooling, providing the information, it's not just about tools, having the tool to provide the information. It's about providing the information in a way that is understandable and actionable to development at the right time in their development process.
Yeah, yes, exactly. I mean, and nowadays it's more than things like dependencies. That used to be the big thing we go around and try and teach developers about, start to take some care about your choices and dependency stuff. But now, of course, it's bigger than that because as we've seen now recently, a lot of things, it's not just you're choosing the code that you're choosing, it's also the tools that you're using, and it's the platforms you're running on, and it's the places where basically bad things can happen is just expanding and expanding. So I quite understand when I was saying expecting that yes to be a lower number is because when you actually start talking to people about the scope of the challenge, then they begin to realize that they are much less prepared than they realize.
Interesting. So, Steve, let me ask you this question. So, is putting security into the hands of developers a good thing or a bad thing?
Oh, it's essential. It's a really good thing, but it depends what you mean by security, right? So one of the things that it's not really the right word. I don't know what the right word is yet. I think about it, but when you talk about security to developers, they mostly think about encryption and authentication. And what we're actually saying is something a lot more subtle than that. And we're talking about how do you make your software safer? And the answer is we have to put this in the hand of developers. It's not, we need better tooling to help the developers focus on the bits that are important. So the dependency management, the build processes, the pipelines, they should just happen. And what we should get developers to look at is software choices for sure, but also start thinking a lot more about how they architect software, how they design it, how they code it, because there's a lot more to security than just managing your dependencies. But I do think it's absolutely essential that the next generation or the current generation of developers are much more security savvy.
Right. Great. Before we started the conversation, Brian, I know you had mentioned a great analogy about security from the automotive world, where the people building the cars are concerned about what's going into the end product and making sure that that's safe, but they're not really thinking about how to protect the factory. And you had pointed out that the infrastructure is where a lot of these new attacks are coming from. People looking to leverage supply chains. How do organizations kind of deal with that?
Yeah, so this is an area I've been kind of talking about since maybe summer 2017, and it's kind of exploded into what everybody recognizes off the back of SolarWinds as a software supply chain problem. Right. But one of the first things that I think happened in 2017 that kind of had me looking around like, anybody else see that? That's really weird, was that some of the vulnerabilities, the malicious components that were published to both NPM and to PyPI repositories, the attacks themselves were actually focused on stealing the credentials of the publishers to those repositories. It wasn't inserting crypto miners. It wasn't trying to steal data from the final shipped software. It was literally, we're putting stuff into the supply chain. We're poisoning the entire world to attack open source publishers. And then unsurprisingly, we saw a lot of follow-ons where a lot more malicious components were published in there. Again, focused on stealing things from the development infrastructure, whether it was AWS credentials to the machines or database passwords that development machines might have access to. And I still see so many organizations that are focused on defending the end product. So this might look like an application security portfolio that says everything must be scanned before it's released, but you can do whatever you want in development. Well, what if your developers accidentally downloaded one of these malicious components that put a backdoor in their system? Don't you care about that? You should. But and in a pandemic world where more and more people are working from home, your traditional perimeter defenses that might have made that backdoor benign in an office might be wide open when somebody's working at home off a VPN, right? So these types of things need to be considered in this new world. And that's why I like to bring this up, because once you recognize that the supply chain attacks are increasingly looking to attack your developers and your development infrastructure, and not necessarily to find their way into your product to attack your customers. You can't help but rethink how you approach the security, that it has to look all the way up to development and track all the things going through development. Of course, defending the application that gets shipped is still important. But if that's the only thing you're focused on, you're missing most of these supply chain attacks.
Yep. Good. So I want to remind our attendees that if they have any questions for Brian and Steve, they can type them in now and we'll get to them. But I have one final question before we get into the Q&A portion, and that is, so what is Sonotypes' approach to security? Is it tooling, training, all of the above? How are you helping organizations tackle this problem?
Well, we provide tooling, right? So I've kind of touched on some of the key tenets of what we're doing, but we've recognized, when we started the company 14 years ago or so, when we were helping people modernize their build systems with Maven, inadvertently we're bumping up against the fact that Maven, the build tool, the most popular build tool for Java, was making it easy for developers to consume dependencies at scale. And it was bumping up against organizational policies that said, you need approval for dependencies and things like this. We kind of saw firsthand the unintended consequences of how those two things clash when the overreactions occur. And so we have tooling that allows you to integrate all the way across the life cycle, because it's important to give you multiple decision points. So you can, for example, warn in development, but fail if it's ignored and try to release. So many people say, well, we just want to break all the builds. It's like, well, okay, if something becomes vulnerable overnight that was already in there, you literally mean stop and break every single build while one developer on each team deals with it. All the rest of the developers twiddle their thumbs watching one guy make a dependency. It's probably not what you meant. And yet that's what everybody's knee-jerk reaction is, right? So we have tooling that does that. We have tooling that can help identify in near real time newly published malicious components, and tooling that can help block your developers from downloading those suspicious components so they can avoid those backdoors. All those types of things. That's what we've been doing at Sonotype for well over a decade now.
Great. All right, so we have a couple of questions we need to get to, and I'll start, I guess, again with you, Brian. So what tips do you have for developers who feel overwhelmed with all of these new duties that have been put on their plate?
You're not alone. And I think it's within your right to ask your organization to help enable you. They can't throw all these requirements down without helping to enable you to make better choices. And if the organization is only being reactionary, only trying to focus on fixing the vulnerabilities and ignoring the higher level things, which maybe we should look for components that have less vulnerabilities just in general. What Ralph Nader said, you can't inspect quality into cars. You can't just build a car and then inspect it until it's until it's safe. It doesn't work that way. You have to move that further up the process. Developers should expect and demand tooling support to be able to help to do that at scale. And part of this it's a culture shift. That if the only thing that an organization is measuring development against is features shipped, on-time delivery types of stuff, and not paying attention to the softer non-functional things like quality, like reducing defects and vulnerabilities and compliance with legal policies, then they get what they measure, which is, not going to help. But we've done a number of studies. It was released in last year's software supply chain report that we found that companies that do an integrated job, a good job integrating the visibility of security and these other things into their process actually outperform the organizations who say the only thing we care about is going fast. It sounds counterintuitive. You would think that speed being of all the only thing of importance would be the fastest, and that you would pay some cost by having a bit of governance in place. But it turns out actually that's not true. The reason for that is the unplanned work that comes on the back end of ignoring the stuff and going super fast. You're still going to have to deal with vulnerabilities and bugs and stuff on the far end, except everybody knows it costs more to do it at the end, right? So if you can find the right approach of integrating that, you can actually outperform the people who say I'm just going fast at all costs, right? Yeah. So those are the kinds of arguments that developers ought to be using, the data that they should be able to supply to their management to push back and say, look, if you actually empower us to do this, not only will we do a better job, we'll be happier, we can actually ship code faster, which is the thing you care about, right?
Yeah, well, you can, at the end of the day, what you're saying is you can deliver value, and you can deliver value faster if you take control of your own destiny. If you're in a panic mode, which happens, you're basically forced to deliver, then things go wrong. And I think it's that military thing about, slow is smooth and smooth is fast, or whatever it is. It's like a different view of what you're trying to do. But I would say the other thing I've noticed with, in terms of taking the fear out of this, is literally start to get educated as a developer. Take some time to go to see what's going on and what's out there. And I think if you can demonstrate that you are proactively thinking and engaging with these ideas, then the management team are more likely to trust you. Because at the moment, quite often, who worries about security? It's the sec in DevSecops, and that's just a mismatch.
Yeah. So I have to apologize right now because one of the joys of working from home is when the landscaper shows up right outside while you're in the middle of a webinar. So okay. If you hear engines roaring and not my voice, I certainly apologize for that. But the next question that we have, if the relationship between your developers and security is not very strong, how do you suggest going about improving that relationship or helping organizations get to the point where they have a good integrated development security situation?
So one way that I've seen in the past it's a DevOps trick, is basically you write yourself a contract, and you not necessarily a paper thing, but what you do is you sit down with the security teams and the development teams, and you work out what a technical dashboard would look like. So, for instance, if you go, we care about vulnerabilities, or we care about things are happening in the logs, then you by creating a common dashboard, literally a dashboard that sums up what the situation is, then I find that what we've seen is the act of creating that means that two parties have to work together to come to a common agreement. And if you can get a common agreement and you can get a dashboard that basically says red or green or whatever, then you find that you've sort of learned what each side is trying to achieve. Because so much of these mismatches are just simply because you have two groups who have different objectives and haven't got a common language. Once you get over that, then things get a lot easier.
Great. Okay, the last question I think we addressed already. It was what tools can folks use to get started to help automating some of this? I think Brian kind of elaborated on some of that earlier. Anything else you want to add to that, or did we cover it all? Guess we covered it all.
Yeah, we covered it all, yeah.
Well, then let me just throw it out to you guys, Brian first and Steve. Maybe you can just in 30 or 60 seconds or so give us your final thoughts, what what we want our attendees to take away from today's session. Brian, we'll start with you.
Remember, your developers and your development infrastructure are under attack. You need to be paying attention to that. If you want your program to actually be effective, you need to integrate it into development, because they're the ones that ultimately need to make the changes that whatever tools are surfacing. Like so many things in tech, it's actually about the people and the culture. If the organization isn't actually really caring about these other dimensions and only giving lip service to it or trying to check the box for an audit, you're not going to be very effective. And you're going to be embarrassed when something bad happens. So let's do a good job ahead of time. Let's not be embarrassed. It is possible. It's not always obvious how to do it, but it is possible to do.
Steve?
Yeah, so what would I say? It is scary out there. It's very scary out there, and it gets scarier day by day. But scary comes from the unknowns. And I think all developers, dev managers, IT guys could do a lot better than to spend time educating themselves on what's going on and looking at the tooling. We have so much opportunity, we have so much stuff that will help, but we've been educated for a long time not to go looking for it. And now is the time to turn that around and start putting effort into education, learning how it works, and taking a good look at the tools that are out there and seeing how much they can help you.
Excellent. Well, Brian Fox, Steve Poole, thank you so very much for being with us today on SD Times Live. Certainly an enlightening discussion on security for developers. I'd certainly like to thank all of our attendees for being here today and all of our listeners. We always appreciate you showing up. And thanks especially to Sonotype for sponsoring today's session. They are, in fact, the provider of wonderful security tools, and you should check them out. And until next time, I'm Dave Rubenstein, Editor-in-Chief of SD Times. So long for now. Thanks, fellas.
Bye.